Welcome back to The Edge. Today I'm joined by Michael Fitch. He's been a bit of a kind of pioneer in the industry.
I came into Monopoly Go when it was already a little bit underway, right? So Scopely had the license for Monopoly as a board game for a while.
And a lot of the work I do is, working with these startup companies or working with the publishers that are looking to scout the next game. And 100% the standards have just gone through the roof.
All of the industry level risk has been outsourced into the indie space. Of making games, you're never going to make it in the industry.
We keep on coming back to this thing. The market at the moment is going through this metamorphosis. And it's a kind of trial by fire.
Like literally, Steam had 14,000 games that released in 2023. Just absurd, right? Nobody could play that many games. There is no market. I mean, even the global market does not support 14,000 games. 90% of those games are not going to make any money.
One of the things I found, the most malleable role I've ever seen in the games industry is executive assistant. Because sometimes you can have executive assistants who are insanely qualified, and they function in a lot of ways like a very high-end producer, but they're kind of managing everyone on behalf of someone's C-suite. And then other times you can have an executive assistant whose role is to fill things in on the calendar and check schedules.
It's all over the place, right? I mean, the game industry is one of the absolute worst when it comes to standardization of titles and roles, right? Ask anyone at any studio what the difference is between a designer and a producer, right? And you'll get different answers from every studio. Oftentimes you'll get different answers from people at the same studio.
This is absolutely fine.
Okay.
Awesome stuff. So, welcome back to The Edge. Today I'm joined by Michael Fitch. He's been a bit of a kind of pioneer in the industry, and he's now well known on LinkedIn, at least, as one of the big industry voices. I guess just to kind of get started, one of the things I'd love to go over or ask a little bit about, it's one of the things I think you're most famous for at the moment. It's Monopoly Go. So I'd love to even I'm a bit foggy about this, and we talked about it previously. What was your role in the kind of creation of that? Were you the person pitching it, or how did that start?
I came into Monopoly Go when it was already a little bit underway, right? So Scopely had the license for Monopoly as a board game for a while. And we had been exploring some other uses for the Monopoly license while I was at Backflip. But Backflip got closed down by Hasbro. And when they closed down Hasbro, as somebody who's been around the industry for a while, I was like, I'm grabbing the best programmer, I'm grabbing the best UI person, I'm grabbing the best prototyper, and we're just going to start a company. And so even before the official company meeting happened, when the email went out saying everybody at 10:30 in the meeting room, I just went out and grabbed the best people, and I was like, hey, we're going to start a company. And then that ran headlong into Scopely was looking for an acqui-hire team that they could put against Monopoly Go. And so we had a meeting in Boulder after the layoff with Scopely, where they basically pitched us Monopoly Go, and we were like, hey, that's awesome. Yeah, let's make that thing, right? And so we had a similar kind of idea at Backflip. But, when Massimo walked into the room that first day, he had the onion. He knew what the game was, right? And that was, I think, part of what sold a lot of people on the project, right? And so the initial Monopoly Go studio was a third ex-Backflip people, about a third Peer Play, who was this group who'd been working with Scopely on Scrabble Go, which was fantastic, right? And then a third of people who were Scopely or had been hired directly for this project, right? And so when we started Monopoly Go, it was this crazy, there's 3 different cultures, there's 3 different ways of doing work, there's 3 different terminologies. We all understood Agile, but in slightly different ways. So when we said sprint review, we all had different expectations of what the actual ritual looked like, right? Yeah. And so we'd all agree, let's do a sprint review. Okay, great. And then someone would run off and do a sprint deck. It would be radically different from somebody else's sprint deck, because they just had completely different expectations about like what's a sprint review, right? And so that first kind of initial thing, I helped broker the deal. I helped bring in the backflip people, and then I stood up. I helped stand up the production processes with our EP, and then I was creative director from the inception of that studio until I left at Alpha.
Gotcha. So, I mean, there's a lot of kind of new studios that are forming at the moment out of this kind of recent kind of layoff period. It's kind of out of the ashes. These new ones are being born. How much kind of similarities or are you seeing when it comes to these new studios and the teams on them, or how they're doing things? Or do you think it's a different ball game to like how you guys end up creating Monopoly Go?
I mean, it's a completely different ball game. You know, the industry is in such a different state right now. As an indie team, it is so hard to pitch yourself. There's so little money on the table. There's so few partners left. And the standards have just been pushed higher and higher and higher, right? You know, back when I worked at THQ, we'd greenlight a group of like 5 guys with a dream, and we'd give them $1 million and say, go build a studio and show us that you can actually make that thing, because it sounds awesome, right?
Yeah.
And those deals are just not available anymore. Nobody's getting those deals. You know, now it is bring a fully working prototype to the table where we can get hands-on and feel the fun for ourselves, or go home, right?
Yeah.
Because we're talking to people who are already in market, who are already getting player data, and that's the standard you're up against in terms of green light these days, right? So I am madly like sympathetic for people who are in the market these days trying to start something up, because it is so hard. And you know, in some ways, we stumbled into an ideal kind of situation where Scopely was profitable, right? Scopely was making mad money off of their 2 kind of tentpole franchises, Star Trek Fleet Command and Marvel Strike Force were both pulling in huge amounts of money, so they could take a flyer. They could say, okay, yeah, we're going to spend 3 more years on this project to see if it does turn into a world-class hit, and sure enough, it did.
Gotcha. I mean, it's something that I've seen 100%. I'm in quite a lucky position in a lot of ways being a freelancer, in that I can have a kind of meta view of what's going on in the industry. And a lot of the work I do is, you know, working with these startup companies or working with the publishers that are like looking to scout the next game. And 100% the standards have just gone through the roof. Like nowadays, if you don't have like a fully fleshed out vertical slice, and a team of veterans who've all done it before, you've got a very slim chance of actually getting a seat at the table.
Even getting in the door, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, there's a few places where, you know, people are more open, but the delta between what the high risk numbers are, which are very small, versus what the low risk numbers are, which are very large, right? That delta is humongous, right? And we've seen this stratification in the game industry over the last 20 years, where you're either working on a micro scale, you're a solo developer, you're under 15 people, you're really scrappy indie kind of like, hey, we're doing this on a shoestring, right? Or you're 100 plus people, right? And the entire middle has gotten kind of wiped out by the industry, right? Either they got acquired, or the ability to fund at that level has disappeared, right? Because the major players aren't worried about, okay, can I get 5 mediocre hits, right? That'll pull in $50 million. They're like, can I get 1 hit that'll pull in $500 million, right? And it's squeezed the entire middle of the industry practically out of existence, right? I mean, not really. We have AA, we have, you know, great folks who are doing work on the indie plus side, right? But from the AAA side, an entire segment of the market has just disappeared.
Yeah. I completely agree. I would say I think it's bold of me to make an industry claim, I think, but I think I am seeing it making a resurgence. You know, there are certain indie titles that were either made by like a few people or one person, and they come out and they've had a massive hit, and those people are then very quickly scaling up their teams. That chap who made, and I'm going to kick myself later if I forget the name of this, the hugely successful city building game.
Manor Lords.
That's it. Manor Lords, yeah. that guy, from what I've heard, is already kind of like, now he's had this huge hit, is planning to expand and build a team, and that's exactly the kind of the middle ground that could develop a huge, very loyal player base. It's where a lot of these bigger brands came from. Was you look at the games like the original Elder Scrolls games or the BioShock games. Those were mid-sized teams that weren't on shoestring, but by no means AAA.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I think there's a lot of growth that's going to happen around these kind of hit and breakout indie games, right? Yeah. There's a well-known kind of pattern that you can see over and over again where somebody strikes a vein and then you get this rush of copycats who come in to kind of commercialize that space, and then somebody else comes in and kind of reinvents that space on the back of that commercialization. We know these cycles, right? So right now it's being driven by indie because all of the industry level risk has been outsourced into the indie space, right? So whereas before publishers, studios had to effectively experiment, innovate, come up with their own internal skunkworks projects, right? Now the indie scene is doing this robust Cambrian explosion of creative exploration, and the publishers can sit over the fray and go, oh, okay, that one's coming along nicely, right? Or that one looks interesting, right? They don't have to fund it; it's already happening, right? Yeah. And one of the most brilliant business maneuvers that I know of was Tilting Point. And if people don't know Tilting Point's story, they really should look it up. This was a group of folks who looked at the mobile scene and said, look, there's all these people out there who are putting decent product out into the world, but they're not making any money, right? And the reason why they're not making any money is they suck at UA and they suck at monetization, right? And so Tilting Point was like, we can be experts in UA and monetization, take whatever products we want to market, turn them into money machines, and then we'll be, sitting on top of piles of money, right? And they literally did that. They went out and they found people who needed support and capital, and they turned them into money-making machines. They were the force behind Coin Master that helped them go from a small little mobile title that was doing decent numbers to a global phenomenon, right? Yeah. And I think part of where we're going as a market is, for a lot of indies, they understand games, but they don't understand community. They don't understand marketing. They don't understand the larger marketplace, right? And that's where I think the big wins are, right? Because so when I started back in 2000, 2001, right, you could do a AAA game with 25 people. And now you can't. You want to do AAA, it's at least 100 people, right? Just reasonably where the standards have gone to, right? So, obviously the costs have gone up along with that, right? But I think, there's a lot of indie people who are kind of functioning in equivalent spaces, right? And the thing that's really open now is that all of the stuff that we used to have to roll from scratch, right? Like your renderer, your engine, your pathing, right? It's all middleware now. You can all get it out of the box, right? And so we're at a place where, as an indie, you can survive on a micro community, right? If you can have 50,000 dedicated players and keep them happy month after month, year after year, you can sustain a small studio on that, right? And that's where I think the real future is, right? Because those studios ultimately become self-sustaining, right? And I don't fully understand the dynamic where successful indie developers decide they want to become publishers because they've mastered it, therefore they can do it for other people, and it's okay, hang on. If the thing that really worked for you is focusing on your community, why are you now focusing on multiple communities, right? Focus on your community, right? The one thing I would say to indies over anything else is, don't worry about the larger market. Don't worry about the VC space. Don't worry about any of those things. Your community and the health of your community is the number one predictor of your viability going forward, right? And so community needs to be first and foremost in everything you're thinking about.
Gotcha. I mean, that's super interesting. I get what you mean, and it translates to larger scale as well. You get these huge kind of studios like GTA 6 or Elder Scrolls 6 that are coming out. Even if those games are amazing, and I've got no doubt they will be, the reason that they're going to make like record-breaking sales is because of these huge pools of dedicated fan base that are going like, I played all the other games and I'm ready to play the next one.
Right. So one of the things that we've seen at kind of the larger industry level is there's this kind of calcification of brands, right? Where it's like, okay, back in 2000, right? You could come out with a brand new experience that nobody had ever seen before, right? And become an instant hit. That's always been true in games, right? But you didn't necessarily have entrenched leaders in every category in the way that you do today, right? It's like you've got your Call of Duties, you've got your Battlefields, like even like first-person shooters now, you've got a whole subsidiary of different branches of this where there are established market leaders, right? Open world games, you're going to get another Grand Theft Auto, you're going to get another Shadows of Mordor, you're going to get another Fallout. You're like, these things are as inevitable as death and taxes now, right? And the amount of money that's going to be poured into those is humongous because the returns are predictable, right? You can look at something like Elder Scrolls and go, okay, yeah, we're going to make $1.5 billion off of that. We can afford to spend $500 million developing that because we're still walking away with $1 billion, right? And those numbers are just made up out of thin air, right? I have no real insight into any of this. But I think that is the scale that we're operating at now, right? Where it's like we're not talking about $50 million bets anymore. We're not talking about $500 million bets anymore, right? We're talking about the scale that AAA is operating at. The reason why people keep going to 4A, quadruple A. What do you even say when you say that?
Yeah,
right?
that's well, I guess is it Ubisoft? Is it Ubisoft that's come out and started doing the 4As? I think so.
Yeah. Which I get, right? Like there's another tier of game, which is like you get to a scale where the organizational complexity of the team that you need to make a game at that scale is its own set of skills, right? Yeah. Which is one of the things I think people outside the industry don't really understand, right? It's like, yeah, you can build a game as an indie, and that's a thing, right? Building a game is definitely a skill that translates all the way through the industry, right? But being able to operate a team that is 100+ people is not a skill that just anybody can develop or have, right? There's a certain set of experiences and talents that you need to be capable of onboarding, right? Because the level of complexity of these projects is phenomenal, right? If you look at something like the Assassin's Creed franchise and what goes into making just one iteration of one of those things, right? It is truly phenomenal. You're talking about almost a dozen studios at this point who are involved in a single iteration of that.
Gotcha. So, when we spoke earlier about kind of the way the industry is always constantly morphing, like all creative industries are, and the video games especially, because barrier to entry is quite low compared to something like filmmaking. If you've got a computer, you can start. But if you were to be entering the industry as a junior now, or someone coming out of uni, or someone that had, not even gone to uni but just like had developed a skill set as they were growing up, what would be your strategy for coming into the market? Would you be trying to join a small team or make your own thing?
I mean, it's such a hard question to answer because, like, it is so much harder for people today than it was when I got in, right? The quality level of entry-level folks today is so much higher than it was when I got in. We're talking about a delta of like almost 25 years. So I'm really out of date and I don't have the right perspective, right? I think the reality is it's just an absolutely brutal marketplace right now. There are so many highly qualified people with experience who are on the market that as an entry-level person, it's near to impossible to get anybody to even take you seriously, right?
Yeah.
So, my classical advice is, spend your time building games, whatever that looks like for you. If you're an artist, spend your time making art. If you are a game designer, spend your time making prototypes. If you're a programmer, spend your time making little games that you can actually ship, right?
Yeah.
And the more you can do that, and the more you can build up a portfolio, and the more that you can talk to real commercial developers as someone who has developed commercial products, the more likely you can get your foot in the door, right? And as far as like how to get your foot in the door, like however the hell you can manage it, right? If you can get on with a large group, fantastic. If you can get on with a small group, more power to you, right? If you can get on with a volunteer group, go, right? Like there's no wrong choice, right? The thing that I think a lot of people don't get about the game industry is there's the fantasy of being a game developer, which a lot of people find very alluring. I would love to be somebody who makes games for a living and gets a say in like how games are made or what choices are made. People love that fantasy, right? The reality is that game development is work, right? And if you don't love the work, the actual in the trenches work of making games, you're not going to be happy even if you do get that job, right? It's just going to frustrate you. The hours are going to be terrible. The pay is going to be terrible. The stress level is going to be through the roof because that's just game development. That's the tax that we pay to do something that we love, right?
Yeah.
So as a junior, as someone who's looking to get into the industry, my best advice is do as much of the work as you can. Develop as close to professional level grade work as you can. Get as close to shipping product as you can. And there's going to be limitations. Like you don't have all the resources. You don't have all the connections. Get out there and network because that's one of the most effective things. It always has been, right? Human nature has not changed in 2,000, 4,000, 8,000 years as long as we have kind of recorded history, right? Knowing the right people has always been the best way in, right? But while you're working that, and it may take years, right, keep working on the skills, right? Because if you don't love the actual work of making games, you're never going to make it in the industry. That's just the baseline.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, as you know, I used to do a lot of recruitment in the games industry. And although I still sometimes dabble, but it was at one point my whole thing. And you see some really kind of interesting people that are coming in, like the things that they do or the strategies they have to get noticed. There's a guy I saw on TikTok actually, recently. There was one person, and they didn't have a fully fleshed out game, but what he had done was create the most complex dragon flying mechanic I'd ever seen. So he had this like beautiful dragon that you could like fly around and shoot fire at these huge swathes of armies, and he'd done it in Unreal Engine, so the whole thing was like hyper realistic. And if you've got something like that in your portfolio, where you're like, this is something you could make a game around, it's the kind of thing that can get you noticed.
Absolutely, right? I mean, portfolio is one of the biggest things for anybody in the industry right now, right? Because everyone, like I said, the market is flooded with people who have great experience, right? If you've got a quick, easy to understand, visually compelling portfolio that's one click away, that's going to give you a huge advantage in terms of getting through that second filter, right? Like, I don't know how deep you want to go into the hiring piece of this, because like we go very deep on the hiring piece, right? But like the hiring pipeline, right, is like a series of gates, right? You have to get through the documentation gate first, right? You've got to have your resume optimized. And I'm not saying like ATS proof or AI proof. That's all bullshit, right? But you've got to have a good resume that can capture somebody's attention, because at some point you need a human to look at that and go, this person looks interesting, right? So that's like step number one, and you're not going to get anywhere if you can't get through that gate, right? When you start to talk to like your recruiters or your kind of general intake people, right, you need to really focus on one set of things, which is like, hey, I'm articulate, I'm responsive, I'm a pleasant person to talk to, right? When you talk to the hiring manager, you have a completely different set of things that you need to get through that gate, right? That's your skills test, right? And at the end of that pipeline, you've got your team test, which is your allergy test, which is not at all about your skills. It's about how much do they want to work with you, right? Yeah. And so as someone who's trying to work your way through that pipeline, you need to optimize for each of those gates individually, right? And so the how do I get in, the portfolio is a key piece, Because if that resume is doing its job, it's funneling them to your portfolio, and the portfolio is getting that initial interview, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. It's another reason why, as sad as the fact of it is, in my time recruiting people, I've seen people who have kind of good enough skills to get through to the interview process, but they absolutely like wipe the floor with people who are on paper far more skilled than them, because they're able to come across as someone who's kind of confident and can work in a team and can be creative and all this sort of stuff. And you have the people that, like, all those things might be true for those other people, but they haven't done the work to kind of make that come across in an interview setting.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot we could get into in terms of like job hunting tips, right? Like doing your research is really critical, right? Being able to talk meaningfully to people. If you get into that interview, being able to talk to them meaningfully about the games that they work on at that studio puts you way, like, head and shoulders above your standard candidate, right? It is ridiculous to me that this is not common practice, but most people will not actually bother to play the games of the studio that they're applying to, even once they've been accepted for an interview, right? And that's like just baseline. You're shooting yourself in the head, right? If you go into an interview not being able to meaningfully talk about a studio's track record, what they've accomplished, what their games are like, you might as well just opt out of the interview process, because somebody else who's done that work is going to mop the floor with you.
Yeah, 100%. It's so crucial, and you see it even at the kind of resume or application stage. You know, with people, there's the whole culture at the moment, because the job market's so tough, is everyone's applying for like 1,000+ jobs. Which of course is this like compounding problem, because then the studios are all receiving thousands of applications,
if not more than.
Yeah.
But they're a studio that can see your resume that's got a cover letter, or like even just a bit at the top that just says, "I'd like to come work for you guys." We have one sentence.
Right.
You know, I've been working in the games industry this much. I'd really like to come work for you guys.
Yeah.
At such and such studio. Makes such a difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. I think the scattershot approach of like more resumes equals more opportunities is the same stupidity that says more hours in seats equals better game, right?
Yeah.
It's like, this is crunch mentality, right? If I just blanket the marketplace with resumes, I have a better chance of getting an in. No, actually you don't. You're hurting your own chances, because not only are you not going to get interest from all these people that you're not tailoring your resume for, they're also going to mark you as, hey, not interesting for future roles either, right? And so like every time you have an opportunity to interact with somebody is a chance to make a positive impression. And every time you send out a blanket resume, you're making a negative impression with the marketplace, and you're hurting yourself, right? So I think people need to understand, like, with no questions asked, right, just blanketing, shotgunning resumes is a terrible strategy for you personally, regardless of what it does to the market generally.
Gotcha. I mean, I completely agree, and it's something that kind of I've seen continuously coming up as we've been chatting. Like, we keep on coming back to this thing of the market at the moment is going through this metamorphosis, and it's a kind of trial by fire, which is why everything is the way it is at the moment. But when you talk about, like, you know, everything now is completely different to how when you joined. Do you see any patterns, or are you seeing any things that's like, I've seen this before, where you could predict like where you think certain things will change or be in 5 or 10 years time?
So I think 5 to 10 years is kind of too far to look out, right? It's kind of like, if you ask a programmer for an estimate and they tell you it's 2 weeks, the answer is really they don't know, right? Because 2 weeks is long enough to figure it out. So, you know, there are definitely trends, right? And you can definitely see the trend lines turning, right? Like, job hiring is starting to pick up again. The layoffs are slowing down. The market is generally shifting back towards more of a stable equilibrium. It's going to take some time. Like, I'm terribly sorry for all the people that are out there like job hunting. It's going to take a while. We're still in a deficit position for months, right? But it is recovering, right? And you can see the wave of VC fundraising that is happening right now is going to shift into real investment over the next couple of years, right? So you can see that there's going to be a lot of opportunities, that there's going to be a lot of things, right? Esports is going to continue to collapse. That seems pretty obvious, right? The Saudis are propping it up, but there's no amount of money that can like fill that black hole. So, you know, there's a few kind of general trend lines like that you can kind of point at, but like the specific things are much harder to identify, right? It's like, okay, there's going to be something, and I don't know what it is yet, that triggers all those VCs to jump in as this is the next new wave, right? What's it going to be? I don't know, right? But it was AI, it was, you know, VR, AR, right? You know, just we've been through all the iterations of this, and they're going to hype cycle it again, and we know that's going to happen, and that's okay, right? But you know, I think the thing that's different now about the industry that's kind of causing a lot of the dynamics that we're talking about is that it's become part of the larger hyper technological manipulation of capital, right? That ultimately games became profitable enough that they became part of these global tech conglomerates like Apple and Microsoft and Google and Amazon and Tencent. And what's happening right now is that you're seeing a real optimization curve in terms of profitability, right? And that's unfortunate for anybody who lives inside the industry because we're essentially getting squeezed for all the margin that is available, right? It's what Amazon did to retail, right? It's what's happening now with games. And it doesn't mean that retail went away. Retail still exists, right? But it's getting harder and harder to compete in games, right? And the capital needed to operate at scale is becoming harder and harder to get access to. Because that's part of the way that monopolies work. They starve the competition for capital, and then they own the space, right? So, you know, I think the biggest thing is, you know, we've got a very limited number of marketplaces right now, right? And that's going to continue to drive the dynamic of high risk, high cost, big investment titles versus organically grown breakout hits. And of the two, you can make your decision about kind of which side of the industry you want to be on.
Yeah. I mean, that's the exact point I was going to make. Is it's one of the big differences, you know, in the comparison between these tech companies or retail companies, or I suppose Amazon's both. But you know, the video game industry is such a creative industry. It's a lot like trying to bully people out of the film space, and you can kind of see in lots of big media companies that make film or TV at the moment when they're trying to churn things out like products. And I won't name any names, but I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. It comes out with a lot of trash, and you know the long-time fans of these kind of groups don't buy it. They start hemorrhaging money. You can get fan-made stuff that's coming out of the same quality,
or higher.
I think, oftentimes higher. And I think video games, you know, they are closer to that than they might be to kind of companies making the new phone or something like that, where no matter how big a company gets, there's, I think, in the game space, there's always going to be room for the little guy to come out with something big.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. So you know, games are fundamentally entertainment, right? In a lot of ways, games are fundamentally like you know, rock music, pop music, movies, televisions, right? Everybody wants to be the pop star of the moment, right? And the reality is that 1 out of every 500 million people who tries to do that thing is going to get that role, right? And so, you know, the game industry is very much in the same dynamic. There are more people who want to be game developers than there are jobs that pay to be game developers. There are more people publishing games on the existing marketplaces than the market could possibly support, right? Like literally, Steam had 14,000 games that released in 2023. I mean, just absurd, right? Nobody could play that many games. There is no market I mean, even the global market does not support 14,000 games. 90% of those games are not going to make any money, right?
Yeah.
And this is fundamentally a problem, right? Because the pressure in terms of where we're a hit-driven industry. We always have been a hit-driven industry because we're an entertainment-driven industries, right? Same as movies, same as music, right? So yeah, there will always be an opportunity for somebody to come out of left field, create something completely new, monetize it effectively in a way that like makes them a star. Vampire Survivor, Manor Lords, right? And great, that's fantastic. I love those people. More power to you. Like if Notch wasn't such a terrible person, I'd celebrate him too, right? But that is not a future for the industry. That's like there will continue to be lottery winners. Right. And just because there will continue to be lottery winners does not mean that you have a sustainable economic system. Right. I think the very sad and kind of unfortunate reality is that at a systemic level, right, the passion tax is a very real thing. And you can squeeze more value out of game developers than you can out of other industries, except for places like, pop music or movies. Because it is a passion-driven industry, right? Yeah. And there are people who are willing to work for just about nothing, as long as they get to work on something that they really love and care about, right? And the thing that we haven't even begun to explore yet is what happens when that wave hits places like Indonesia and Brazil, where people have been living on next to nothing for a very long time. And when they get access to technology and they're able to do things, oh my God, like the outburst of creativity we're seeing now is just a fraction of the outburst that we're going to see 15 years from now, right? I don't know. Maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10. Like, again, predicting the future is a bad business. It's you're bound to be wrong.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're 100% right. I'm already seeing it happening on my end of things. That a lot of the guys that are, in this really tough world of pitching to VCs or publishers at the moment, one of the things they will say is, what we're going to do is build a remote team from South America, and it's going to cost you a third of what a US team would cost.
Yep.
And that outsourcing, it's still in its early days comparatively, because you often get these big companies that do hire from these places and will pay, not the same amount, but similar amounts to what they would pay to US people, but I feel like there's already the trend is beginning of people going, we can get some super cheap labor from these areas.
Oh, it's already started, right? I mean, Tencent a decade ago was already like planting seed investments in these markets because they're not stupid. They know what's coming, right? Vietnam has really blown up as a place for outsourcing because the quality of technical production there is generally pretty high, right? Indonesia's coming online. Gameloft has a big group there, right? India is really robust right now, right? Just a lot of it's not making outside of India's borders, but the internal scene there is going crazy. It's very similar in some ways to the early stages of the Chinese market back in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah. I think it's always interesting when you look at kind of the macro world economics of the games industry, because of course it's all affected by so many things. Russia had a pretty thriving games market that is collapsing now. So anywhere can have a war, anywhere can have a dictator, and anything can completely change. One of the huge things I saw that's come out of China recently, have you heard about the new bills? I guess it's not called bills over there, but the new laws they passed when they banned games from doing sign-in rewards, and they banned games from being able to do the gambling loot boxes to market them to kids. And overnight, I think it was either 8 or 18 billion got wiped off of the two biggest companies in China.
So that was very newsworthy, and then of course the Ministry of Culture turned around and walked that back a few weeks later because they were like, "Wait a minute, that's way too big of an impact." So China's really interesting, and I really caution anybody who hasn't done business in China to be too definitive about their understanding of what's going on in China, right? because the Ministry of Culture and Tencent and the other major players in the Chinese economy are in a very complicated dance, and it has a lot to do with face and public positioning and like the reputations of the individuals, the companies, and how they're represented domestically, and what the rhetoric is around tech and progressivism generally within the culture. So it's really a nest of really tightly related different things that are going on when announcements like that happen, right? So my take on it, and I may be just as stupid as other people, right, is that basically there's somebody at the Ministry of Culture who is like, I'm establishing my authority over this, right? And then they do this from time to time. This is very regular. This is not out of normal operating procedure, right? And then like it had the impact that it had, right? And then the people in the Communist Party who actually care about the economy went and said, "Fucking shut up," right?
Yeah.
And they went, "Okay," because the reality is that the politics and economics in China is much more brutal than people understand, right? There's this sense that China's just a different version of capitalism. It's like, no, that could not be farther from the truth.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's so much of it from, and again, like yourself, I'm speaking as someone who doesn't actually have very kind of complex understanding, but so much of it is kind of dynasties, not real dynasties, but kind of families. Where a lot of this nepotism, lots of people are just kind of being handed government roles.
I mean, it's all about like who who you're related to, and what your pull is, right?
Exactly.
Because the Chinese ruling class has always been very much about hierarchy, right? Mm. It's all about what's your position in the great chain of being.
Yes, exactly. And I suppose in that sense, it's not too different in some ways from the American game market, because at the end of the day, if you do know someone and you need to get something pushed through to a big platform or a big publisher, a lot of it will be about who you know, and what your sway is within the industry, in the same way over here as well.
Well, so that's a different dynamic. Like there's a level at which like the people who are like secretaries in the world are actually the most powerful people, right? Because they know how to get shit done, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's this whole like layer of the game industry that very rarely gets any light on it at all, right? Which is the interface between the platform holders and the publishers and the developers, where like all of those niggling little issues about like TRC compliance and like how does this operate, right, get worked out. And you're absolutely right? Knowing the right people, having the right relationship, being able to like call the right person and say, hey, can we get an exception for that? It's why AAA is AAA, right? Because they know how to do that, and the competition does not.
Yeah. It was one of the best pieces of advice I was ever given when I was starting out, and I was kind of, bringing on clients as a freelancer when you've got no history of freelancing, it's that kind of egg and chicken situation. And so one of my mentors said to me, whatever you do not go to the gatekeepers, because their job is to keep the gate.
That's right.
Never go to the assistant
Never.
or the receptionist, because all they're going to do is be like, let me take
Nope.
your number, all right, jog on.
Yeah. Their job is to keep you out of people's radar, right?
Yeah.
And so like the flip side of that is like once you're on the inside, right, you need those people on your side, right? Like in any organization, there are people who actually get things done, and those are the people who matter, right? And it doesn't matter what their title is, because sometimes it's like some junior guy in IT who just happens to know how to actually get things fixed, right? And it's like, no, your job is to figure out who those people are, right? Because ultimately you need to be successful, right? And so you need to know, okay, if I need to get this thing approved, who do I need to get it through, right? And sometimes it's not the person who's in charge of it, it's the person they trust.
Yes, exactly. It's one of the things I found, the most malleable role I've ever seen in the games industry is executive assistant. Because sometimes you can have executive assistants who are insanely qualified, and they function in a lot of ways like a very high-end producer, and they're kind of managing everyone on behalf of someone's C-suite. And then other times you have an executive assistant whose role is to fill things in on the calendar and check spreadsheets.
It's all over the place, right? I mean, the game industry is one of the absolute worst when it comes to standardization of titles and roles, right?
Mm.
Ask anyone at any studio what the difference is between a designer and a producer, right? And you'll get different answers from every studio. Oftentimes, you'll get different answers from people at the same studio.
Yeah. Yeah, it is what, and then also, I mean, even then, you've got there's no kind of that you've got seniors and leads and level ones and level twos, and every studio's got their own way of doing things on the seniority level as well. A director at
Yeah.
one studio could be a guy managing 20 people, and another studio
Yeah.
is just a guy who really, really knows his stuff.
Yeah. Well, and some of the companies were terrible because they would intentionally obfuscate those things, right? Like EA had a standing policy that they didn't want to have labels, job labels that anybody else could map to because it made it easier for them to negotiate, right?
Yes.
And so producers at EA were designers, and people actually doing production work were called development directors. And it's like, so if you went to EA to design something, you didn't actually want to be a designer because the designers reported into the producers, right? Designers at EA were just executors. They were technical implementers, right?
So, if you were back in startup world, or say that there was a group of people doing startup, maybe they're a group of veterans that got together after layoffs, maybe it's a group of kids straight out of uni. But if you've got a team of like 10, 20 people where you need kind of these levels of seniority in different roles, and you need some kind of cohesion when it comes to organising people. What would you advise in terms of very simple early days? This is how we organise the kind of the people that we're working with, so not everyone's going off and being a cowboy.
I'm sorry, getting a little bit of like weird static on the line, so it's a little hard to understand the question. If I understood correctly, you're asking about like a 10 to 20 person startup team. Like, how do you organize that effectively?
Yeah.
I think the thing for small teams that's really critical is that there's a transition point in that range that you have to handle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're like 5 people, it's pretty easy, right? Because everybody can have direct communication with everybody else. Having a conversation with everybody in the room is pretty fast. It's pretty efficient. It's easy to get to a sense of understanding, consensus, alignment, and so you can move pretty quickly, right? And the research says that starts to drop off pretty significantly at 8 people, and by the time you get to 15 people, you're done. Like you need a completely different structure that you're organizing around, right? So the path that I always try to take teams through as we're growing is, okay, let's get one team really working well, right? Everyone who matters is focused on one thing, right? And just make sure we understand we're speaking the same language. What are we making? How do we deliver it? What are our rituals? What are our touch points? What's everybody's roles and responsibilities, right? But you have to get it right with one team before you try and split the teams, right? And a lot of people make the mistake of immediately trying to go to a multi-lane structure. And it's like, no, until you've built the tissue, the memory, the ability to function as a team, you need to fix that. That needs to be your number one priority, right? Because establishing the dominant culture of the studio is your number one job, right?
Yeah.
And then when you get to that point where you have to make that transition, you need to be very intentional about, okay, we're splitting from 1 lane to 2 lanes, right? Mm-hmm. And this is what that means, right? This is how that's going to change our decision-making process. This is how that's going to change our review process. It's going to change our rituals, our how we relate to each other, right? Because going from 1 team to 2 teams is a radical shift, right? And your management has to be prepared to shift their responsibility as that happens, right? Because like just say creative leadership, right? A creative leader can be directly involved when there's only 1 team, right? And they can be owning all the details, right? As soon as you go to 2 teams, that second team has to be able to function without them there, right?
Yeah.
And if you're building a structure where there's anybody who's critical path for both teams, you're handicapping yourself, right? You're basically shackling your own legs, and you're not going to get velocity, right? So, there is no one size fits all like solution to that. Like for some people, by the time you're up to 20, you're actually at like 3 or 4 different teams, right? Because you're working in smaller groups with tighter definitions, more kind of focused objectives, right? For other people, by the time you get to 20, you're really only in 2 teams because each of the teams is pretty robust, right? But my rule of thumb is, you always want to get the first team running first. When you do the split to 2 teams, you're going to be able to cheat because you can have people on 2 teams and they can still be mostly functional, right? But one of the red lines that you don't want to cross is that when you get to 3 lines, you don't want to have anybody who's in all 3, right? Because people just on a day-to-day basis, right? You can schedule enough check-ins to be a part of 2 initiatives, 2 groups that are functioning. Nobody can make enough time to be in more than 2, right? So if you're doing that, you're screwing your team, right? Because by definition, you're not giving them the support that they need.
Gotcha. Well, I really appreciate you hopping on with me today. I'm conscious that I don't want to take up too much of your day, and you've already put out, a substantial block for me. But I really appreciate having you on. And it was a pleasure.
That's always a pleasure to talk about this stuff, right? I mean, I think everybody enjoys being an expert, talking about their own experiences, right? So, I hope it's useful for somebody. I hope somebody out there hears it and feels like, okay, somebody knows how terrible it is out here. Somebody knows how awful, the experience is because, it sucks, right? And I think, particularly for people who are looking for work, it feels very isolating. It feels like you're the only one, right? Like you're broken. Like everybody else has got, a job. Everyone else has got somebody who loves them. Everybody else has got somebody who cares, right? But when you don't have a job and can't get anybody to get on the line with you can't get anybody to talk to you, it feels like you're just the most worthless human being in the whole world, right? And the whole society just turned its back on you, right? And that's not true, right? There are people all around who are trying to help. I love the amirsatvad.com, right? It's full of resources, right?
Yeah.
I love the game industry.
For anyone who's watching.
Yeah, I mean, we reach out all the time and try and help each other because we know what we do is hard, because we know what we do is a passion, because we know it takes a different kind of person to want to make these kinds of things, right? And so, I'm very sorry, I'm very sympathetic, but there is help, and reach out, especially if you're struggling, because there are people who want to help.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
It's been a pleasure. All right.
Likewise.